Hey, so welcome to another episode of Andrew's Take. This is going to be a sort of informal, unscripted conversation about NATO and Trump's European diplomacy, because there's been some recent developments on those fronts. So I want to start with NATO, and then we'll move over to his diplomacy. But I want to give a sort of disclaimer first, okay? If you hear something that you don't like or doesn't align with how you view things, just hear me out. My goal here is not to be part of the partisan echo chamber. There's plenty of content like that out there. Okay, so if you hear something that maybe you disagree with or you think is wrong, just hear me out, because my goal is to be honest, okay? And I'm not trying to give a false sense of balance or anything like that. Genuine honesty, okay? And I've thought a lot about these things. Thought a lot about them. So hear me out. All right? So let's start with NATO. I have been quietly very happy with Trump's rhetoric around NATO for quite some time. Okay? Not everything he says, but the primary piece of unfairness of Europeans paying their fair share, yeah, I've been very supportive of that. Let me explain why. The European Union is the second largest economy in the world. Okay, it's got nations like France, Germany, Italy. These are huge economies. And then if we add the UK in there, which is not part of the EU, it's not part of the European Union, but it's part of NATO, it's part of European defense. These are prosperous, powerful nations. And there's no reason why they shouldn't be the frontline guarantors of their own continent's security. Okay? That should just be set as a baseline. They have robust and sophisticated militaries. Um, the French have a near full spectrum military industrial complex. They can, along with their European partners, and of course the United States, but they really can produce, and they do, a lot of military hardware and armaments. So this idea that the United States needs to take the front line here, this is old thinking. Okay, and it comes from a time when the United States did need to be that guarantor, specifically during the Cold War. After World War II, the Soviet Union had swallowed up Eastern and Central Europe, and United States power secured Western Europe from falling under the Iron Curtain, from being absorbed into this Soviet empire. So there was a good reason. It's not like NATO didn't have a function and it wasn't mutually beneficial. But times have changed. Times have changed. Germany is the third largest economy in the world. Okay, it just overtook Japan recently. Germany is a sleeping giant. So is Japan. After World War II, their militaries were sort of disassembled, or they had very small militaries. As the Cold War ratcheted up, Western Germany did have a military, Eastern Germany had a military, but the Germans, for the past, when they unified in the 90s, they've been hesitant. Okay. They've been hesitant to take on this role because of history. And that makes sense to a degree, right? They have this really, you know, this really awful history of trying to conquer Europe twice. And tens of millions of people died. So they're still trying to grapple with that history, but it's 2026. Okay, we know that Germany is not a Nazi fascist nation. They are one of our greatest allies. So the idea that Americans need to expend our blood and treasure as the front line, it's old thinking. It's no longer necessary. So the idea of fairness of Europeans, taking the front line there, I appreciated that. I really did. It of course it wasn't Trump's rhetoric that ultimately changed this dynamic. It was Putin's invasion of Ukraine. That was the main catalyst that changed the thinking of Europeans, but particularly the Germans. So when people hear this, they're they may feel some way. Okay. When I hear generals, and that's really who the media puts on. They put on generals, and I could do a whole episode about this. Um, Americans have this idea, and it's frankly, as a veteran and as someone who understands it, it's frankly frustrating when people talk about America's role in the world, because a lot of the time the people have such passionate feelings about U.S. Involvement around the world and in Europe and having this main role in NATO. It's usually from people who don't actually have to sacrifice much of anything. Maybe some of your taxes that we all do, but it's not anyone's fault. It's not like you shouldn't look at yourself and be like, I'm one of these people. He's coming after me. I'm not. I'm not. It's really no one's fault. It's just an effect. It's a symptom of having an all volunteer force. Okay, and I'll do a whole episode about that because there are a lot of socio-economic, cultural implications that go along with this switch from the draft military that we had to an all volunteer force, right? Like think of Vietnam. That was the main catalyst for switching to an all volunteer force was, you know, people who were drafted, they didn't want to go fight in this war. So you had, the public had that say, and they didn't have that buy-in. But with an all volunteer force, we've seen this in conflicts around the world. Americans don't even know where their troops are fighting. Like I guarantee, and again, not this isn't about shaming you, but this is about a little bit of self-reflection. If you've had this idea like America should be fighting this person or bombing this country, it's like, can you even find them on the map? That should always be like your first. Can you, as an American voter, as someone who may have opinions about these things, can you find this country on a map? If the answer is no, you should slow down. So a lot of Americans get these, grandiose ideas like, oh, we need to, defend Europe because of XYZ. Are you going to go defend Europe? And that's always a question I have for people when they ask me these questions. They're like, should we go send troops to Ukraine, or should we get involved in this Middle Eastern country, or should we bomb them or whatever? I'm like, are you going to go fight? Is your sibling going to go fight? If the answer is no, then you should probably reconsider what you're even asking. And to people who do serve and they feel differently, very well. By all means, you I think have earned the right to, have that opinion. Okay? But a lot of Americans who have such strong opinions US involvement and military power and getting involved in these issues, they don't you don't really have any stake in it. Doesn't affect you in any way. Um, so it's just something to think about, you know. The troops, our troops are good. We have a very good military. You know, the Marines, I can speak from, personal experience. The Marines are America's guard dogs. The Marines are America's guard dogs. They are ready to be let off the leash, but that doesn't mean that they have to be just because they're ready, and we want them to be ready. But they have families, they have lives, they want to grow old, and we shouldn't be sending them to go die in places you can't even name because you think it's a good idea. Because at the end of the day, who cares if you think it's a good idea? Okay. I know that's like, well, what about this and that? That's the symptom of the all volunteer force. Okay. You could say, thank you for your service, give a 10% discount, and then go on with your day. But you don't actually have to, expend your own blood or see people that you care about, that you serve with, go die. The troops, they're not toy soldiers, right? And I think Americans sometimes feel righteous when they're like, we'll send our troops here, we'll do this, we have to defend this place, we have to. But if you're not actually making that sacrifice, then it just comes out hollow. Okay, so I appreciated Trump's rhetoric around Europe. There's no reason why Germans and French and British and Spanish and Italian troops can't be the front line for Europe. They are perfectly capable of doing that. Okay, so I appreciate it. His Trump's way of looking at the world is through transactions. He's like, is it fair? Is it unfair? That's what he talks about with his rhetoric. He thinks the Americans are kind of being ripped off. And, that wasn't true for a very long time. But I think it's fair to say that, yeah, I mean, it is kind of silly that America has to guarantee these incredibly rich and prosperous nations with our children, with our 18-year-olds. It's just, and you'll hear mostly from the media, like main media, left to right. You'll hear they'll bring on generals. That's the only people that the media puts on, unless they want to grandstand with some, veteran, like, oh, look at this person, here's a heartfelt story. But they don't, when they're like, I want a serious opinion, they go to the generals. Let me just say this right now, and I've read an exorbitant amount of work from soldier scholars, from generals and from people who were officers and then became historians. I've read so much of their work. Generals are the most unimpressive class in the military. It's okay. Like, the media doesn't understand. They're like, "Oh, they're the top guys, so they must have the most brilliant and best opinions." But I follow. There's like a few, right? There's a few. There are exceptions. I think if you've ever heard of James Mattis, he was a pretty incredible general. It's actually a commentator for, and this isn't an endorsement, but they do have someone good on Fox News. He's one of their commentators. He's a general. He's very good. I forget his name. I'll put it in the comments, but he's good. There are very few though. Generals are, for the most part, they're systems experts. Okay, they're managers. They're quasi politicians. There's very few who are actual war fighters. Right? These aren't Napoleons. These aren't Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. These aren't generals of that sort. These are, what I just stated. That's what they really are. for the most part. You want to get some really good opinions, some really smart work, go for those staff NCOs, those NCOs, right? Non commissioned officers in the enlisted side and the officer side from like captain to colonel. Really good. They're still leading troops. It's still fresh in their minds. They understand things. That's where the sweet spot is. But you don't get that. So the American public sees the generals, and the generals have very simplistic worldviews, right? They do treat the troops like toy soldiers for their own grandiose musings. Like, oh, we need to. I'll always see, Ben Hodges, right? You can look him up. He's always a commentator on center left medias. He's infuriating because his just own sense of self importance is so obvious, and he just thinks he's so right because he has his ideas and he's a general. And it's so silly because I it, and this comes because I know what they talk like. I know how they write. They have very elementary understandings of history. Very very unimpressive. So it's not the American public's fault. The all volunteer force, and all you hear is generals and their opinions are terrible for the most part. There are exceptions, but for the most part, they are terrible. So, just keep this in mind with NATO, right? Like times have changed and things are changing because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, because the Europeans feel like they can't rely on us anymore. And that gets me to my second point here, Trump's European diplomacy. So if you're a fan of Trump, you may have liked what I just had to say. You may have been like, yeah, okay, you probably won't like this part, but I encourage you not to shut this off or shut me out. Okay. Because again, I'm here for honesty. Trump has been a disaster for our European alliances. That is just a fact. And it is very evident with a speech that was just given. This was given by the Canadian Prime Minister, right? So not Europe, but he is talking to Europeans, and Europeans are aligned with this over Greenland. This is just after Greenland. He gives a speech at Davos. It's this big, meeting. I won't go into it, but he gives a very important speech, and it's meant for. He's implicitly talking about the Americans, and he's talking to Europeans and other nations around the world, but particularly the Europeans over this last debacle with Greenland, because the US has unfettered access to Greenland already. We don't need to own it. And to have this big spat with Denmark, it was just useless. It was useless political theater, and it had more to do with selfish reasons than any sort of strategic concern. And if it was about strategic concern, it was done incredibly poorly. And what that says to me is that Trump fundamentally does not understand history. He doesn't. He doesn't, and that's just a fact. His ideas are based on transactions. He's a businessman, right? That's his whole shtick. But history matters. Okay. And the nature of our relationship with Europe is based on history, the past 80 years, post World War II, during World War II, even. And so he comes at it with this idea of unfair, which when talking about NATO and them paying their fair share, I agree. Yeah, they should. But then to try and bully our allies, he fundamentally doesn't understand the role of US hegemony in Europe. Hegemony means domination, right? Influence. It is not empire. We don't hold, and people will make this argument. That's very well. There are good arguments out there. But it's I don't agree with that. It's not empire in a strict sense. It is hegemony. And they know this. this is an open secret. This is an open secret. And Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, sort of says that out loud, right? I have the transcript here. I can read part of it. You can go look online if you don't want to hear me rattle off about it, you can look online and hear it. But he's essentially talking about the rupture. This That's the key word he uses. This is a rupture. This is a major break in how this hegemonic relationship has worked. Sometimes it's easier to think about it from a perspective that isn't our own because our own politics are so partisan. So if you're a fan of history, I am. I love history. I love the ancient world. I'm going to do a big faux pas, which is a comparative analysis. These are done frequently and usually poorly, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So if you know anything about Sparta, right? Just in the nature of a hegemon and subordinate relationship between a hegemon and these willing partners. And that's what Sparta had actually in ancient Greece among many different governments, many different states is a hegemonic role in Greece. And you see that in the Persian Wars, right? If you know anything about the Persian Wars, the Persians come over, they move into mainland Greece, and a coalition led by Sparta of these free city states meets the Persians on land and sea, right? But Sparta doesn't control these other city states directly, but it leads them. And the city states accept that leadership. They sacrifice some of their freedom in foreign policy for their own security. We see this with Athens after the Persian Wars, right? Another great time. Athens takes the fight to Persia, creates something called the Delian League, right? Because they kept their treasury on the island of Delos. And this is a coalition of the willing at first, same as Sparta before, a coalition of willing. They accept Athenian hegemony because Athens is the great naval power. And so they all work together. But both Sparta and Athens abuse this eventually. They abuse this relationship. They push the allies too far. They start to abuse them. They start to run roughshod over them. And what becomes a coalition of the willing, understanding that Sparta or Athens is the hegemon and they willingly accept that, it becomes something more sinister. And these city states who were on their side turn. They they conspire against them. They hedge their bets. And that's what's happening with Europe right now. Europe is hedging, so is Canada. Trump threatens them with tariffs because they show solidarity with Denmark. That's an abusive relationship, which tells me he fundamentally doesn't understand the nature of our relationship with Europe. As a coalition of the willing, we can only push them so far. We only have so much influence. European countries are not our vassals. Okay? They are not our vassals. We are not their imperial overlords. Where if they don't abide by our wishes, then we can just punish them. And this is what Trump doesn't understand. Okay. And it's clear in the way he negotiates. There was flags that were taken outside of the US embassy in Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, that were to honor the 42, I think, service members of the Danish military who who died in Afghanistan when we activated Article 5 of the NATO treaty alliance. We're the only nation to do so ever. They came, and per capita, more Danes died than any other European country. What a gross and petty insult it is to to rip those flags out because we're having a spat. It's so unnecessary. And the Danes are they are outraged. Europeans are outraged. And now they're hedging. The European Union just signed a massive trade deal with South America. Britain is in talks with China. The European Union is reproaching with China. If they can't rely on us as that hegemon, they're going to hedge their bets. It's about their own security, their own sovereignty as people, as nations. And that's what's so fundamentally frightening about this moment is that Trump just genuinely doesn't understand that. And the ramifications are going to be severe. So I'm going to leave you with part of Mark Carney's speech. You can, end it here if you want, or you can listen because it's really powerful words. And it really gets at what's happening right now. So let's get that started then. So this is Mark Carney. He's the Prime Minister of Canada, and he's implicitly talking about the United States, and he's speaking really to Europe and other allied nations and the whole world, really. Okay. So this is how it goes. Today, I will talk about a rupture in the world order, the end of a pleasant fiction and the beginning of a harsh reality where geopolitics among the great powers is not subject to any constraints. But I will say, on the other hand, that other countries, especially middle powers like Canada, are not powerless. They have the capacity to build a new order that encompasses our values, such as respect for human rights, sustainable, sustainable development, solidarity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states. It seems like every day we are reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules based international order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second. That is a line from Thucydides from the episode with Milos. If you're a historically minded person, you understand immediately what I'm talking about. That is a famous line from Thucydides, speaking about Athenian abuse of power and hubris. Okay, so I'm going to continue now. We knew the story of the international rules based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful, and American hegemony, in particular, helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and frameworks for resolving disputes. So we participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. But this bargain no longer works. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. When countries only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, they negotiate from weakness. They accept what is offered and compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty, it's a performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. So I'm going to end the quote there. Talked about two elements here: NATO, which I think he did a service to Americans by pointing out that the Europeans should be paying more, they should take the front line in their own security. But I also talked about his diplomacy with Europe, which has been catastrophic and has possibly done fundamental damage, irreparable damage, to our relation with our neighbor to the north and our European allies. This is Andrew's Take. See you next time.